So this is so-called the graveyard slot. And when Ruth asked me to do this, I had no idea what I'd get into. But the more I've looked into it, the more fascinated I've got by the issues that the question of how early Methodists regarded the options for burial as fascinating. The subtitle is The Law of Baptism and Burial, because in the newspapers of the time, and my main sources have been the newspaper archive and the Primitive Methodist magazine, the books that there are published on nonconformist burial or burial generally in the 19th century comment prominently that there is no serious study of nonconformist burial practice and that is an omission. So obviously I've been trying to get in to an area where it's been a case of being surprised at what I've found. So Methodist burial practice, the Times of 1871, at the height of the controversies, said no differences are as deep as those which arise over the grave. And at this time, there was front page publicity being given to the controversies that were arising. The subtitle of the Law of Baptism and Burial was that the controversies arose primarily over the burial of babies who had been baptized only by nonconformist ministers. The burial of adults was not primarily an issue that caused the controversy. The controversy was babies, typically up to a year old, who had only been baptized by a Wesleyan or a primitive minister, or in the case of Baptist congregations, not at all. And we'll come on to those. So the background to this is that from 1800 particularly, there were arising competing pressures for burial reform. The Church of England had historically, as we know, had the control of burial, and more importantly, the control of the finances and the economic benefits. And interestingly, with the discussions on setting up public cemeteries, many Church of England dioceses were paid financial compensation for the loss of income that was perceived to arise. Church of England wished to maintain control wherever possible, but there was increasing pressure from dissenters who wanted their own rights and especially wanted non-consecrated graveyards. Now, I have to say this surprised me, particularly about non-consecrated graveyards. As a minister, I'm used to going into public cemeteries, and the bit on the left is the dissenters' cemetery, and the bit on the right is the Anglican cemetery. But I hadn't realized that these dissenters' cemeteries are not generally consecrated. We'll come on to that. And the third pressure was public health and hygiene. So the cholera epidemics of 1839, 1848 and 49 gave an added impetus, and there were government working parties that were established to look into the effect of the cholera epidemics. It was misguided in that they believed miasma was the cause of the illness, but it was beneficial in that there was a control and in fact a stop to many of the intramural interments, that is those burials within the church and or chapel, and we'll come on to that. So it was a problem, both rural and urban, of space, and there were three options: to have a churchyard extension, which was the cheapest, but that retained the control of the Anglican Church; to provide burial board cemeteries, but economically that was only generally possible in the market towns; or the initial denominational option, which was to provide mausoleums or crypts, or to purchase denominational burial grounds where that was possible. The lady who's the expert apparently on 19th century burial, Julie Rugg, R-U-G-G, of York University, says that graveyards are for the general public, burial grounds are denominational. So she differentiates between those. And again, I was surprised at the extent of mausoleum provision, of crypt provision, and I was also surprised how difficult it was to get information on those. But I have one or two examples to give. So solutions 1 and 2 particularly raise the issue of how to manage these developments where there were different denominational use, either in an Anglican churchyard or in a public cemetery. Owen Chadwick, in his book, The Victorian Church, says until 1880, the churchyard was a rural problem, and it was the one remaining principal grievance. And certainly, as we look at the controversies, there is no doubt that that was the grievance. And Chadwick gives this statistic that in 1876 in Lincolnshire, there were 634 dissenting chapels, but only 48 cemeteries and 540 odd churchyards. That there was a mismatch between the dissenting chapels and the provision of the burial provision. And to emphasize that throughout the 19th century, parishioners had a right to be buried in the parish churchyard if they were baptized. But correspondingly, they had a right to have the burial service read by the incumbent or deputy. And I know from my explorations at Epworth that it felt to the Epworth Methodists that they could have their service in the church, their service of thanksgiving, in the meeting house as it was then. But to effect the burial, they had to go to the Lich Gate, and it seemed to them that they handed over the body of their deceased brother or sister to be into the care of the Anglican curate, who had the right then to read the Anglican burial service, come what may. And this could cause controversy. So the effects of burial reform were firstly it established the right to be buried in the parish graveyard, given 48 hours notice. That intramural interments were generally discouraged. They did carry on in certain places. I gather if you were a member of the royal family, you were then and you are now able still to have an intramural interment, that is to be buried within a place of worship. The development of cemeteries through joint stock financing and the York General Cemetery, 1836, is said to be the first. And John Petty, Primitive Methodist minister, was buried there in 1868. And it led up to the Morgan Burial Act. Osborne Morgan was a Welsh MP who continually agitated for burial reform, and eventually allowed graveyard burial without the rites of the Church of England, or indeed without any religious rites. And it was prompted by something called the Door Graveyard Controversy. Now, I wasn't able to find anything written up about the Door Graveyard Controversy. So what I have on that particular controversy, which we'll come to, is solely from the newspaper archive. It makes fascinating reading. And I know this is the weekend of Halloween. These controversies are about families being locked out of the churchyard. These controversies are about having to break into the churchyard in the dead of night and bury babies by the light of lanterns. These controversies are about vicars charging Primitive Methodist ministers with indecent behavior because they sung hymns in the churchyard over the grave. It is astonishing. Perhaps the most famous grave in Methodism, the one which John Wesley used, was his father's in Epworth churchyard. And I just put that as a note, still there. Now, I said that there was an agitation for unconsecrated ground, and Julie Rugg, who I've already mentioned, attributes this to John Wesley, and he wrote, "I have never wished any bishop should consecrate any churchyard or burial ground of mine, and that such consecration was authorized neither by any law of God or by any law of the land." And he goes on to say, "If any grave be dug too deep, I may happen to get out of consecrated ground." Now, I wasn't aware of this. Some of you might have been, but I wasn't aware of the strength of feeling that Wesley had about consecrated land, and that it shouldn't be consecrated land, and the effect that this appears to have had upon the early Methodists. So option one was really to accept the position. And I've got an example here. I'm sorry, it's an Epworth example. It's in the Armenian magazine for 1812, where a lady called Anne Moore died in Epworth. And there was clearly a very harmonious relationship between the Wesleyans of Epworth and the neighbouring parish church of Haxey. We proceeded to conduct the funeral according to her request. We sang and prayed in the house, and then we sung before the hearse out of town and up to Haxey High Street. And the vicar, the Reverend Mr. Lamb, politely gave us to sing in church. And am I only yet to die? Her remains are deposited in the middle aisle near the pulpit in the family vault. And this was intramural interment in the family vault. And such intramural interments were a major source of finance to the parish churches. I understand that the nearer you got to the East End, the more you had to pay, for perhaps obvious reasons. So certainly in 1812, in rural Lincolnshire, at least in this particular instance, it was working with a degree of give and take on both sides. But that was not to be the case, and the position was to deteriorate significantly. The other option was to use other land. Again in Epworth, it's well known that there was a conflict with the vicar about 1850, and the Wesleyans used the manse garden as the burial ground. This is the old Wesleyan manse, and the memorial headstones were still there in 1949 when it was sold just before the war. I have to say that as a Methodist minister, I don't think this is a practice I wish to encourage, that you should use the manse garden as a burial ground. But I'm told it grew good carrots. Okay. Then we had the development of local authority cemeteries from 1850, and with specific dissenting sections that were non-consecrated. There was the other option of using dissenting chapels who had, and particularly the historic dissenting chapels, Baptists or Independents. And I have the example here that W.G. Bellham, Primitive Methodist travelling preacher, died in 1854 and was interred in Ramsgate Independent Chapel because it was the best option at the time. And some of the early Wesleyan chapels had their own mausoleums. So this example of Waltham Street Wesleyan Chapel, Hull, and I'm indebted on this account to Terry Hurst, who supports Anglesey Brook. He's a member of the Wesley Historical Society, who's done a lot of research on this particular chapel. And the two bits at the side are the mausoleums. Two bits at the side are the mausoleums, or I should say were the mausoleums. And the register, 295 interments from January to May 37, and 38 to 54, 244 entries. It was well used. And then Queen Street, Huddersfield, and Ted Royal's listening into this. I used his book as a source on Queen Street. And it records that there was a crypt containing 31 catacombs capable of 1,000+ burials. And when it was looked into, there were 84 burials in lead-sealed coffins. Queen Street actually had a problem when it had the visit from the government agency, which I'll come on to. Bethesda at Chapel had 4 burial vaults. So this is Methodist New Connection, including a minister's vault. And in 1898, Elizabeth Moore, the widow of a layman, was interred with a sign on the minister's vault, because she wasn't a minister, saying, placed here owing to all the other crypts being full. So the intramural interments at Bethesda Hanley carried on through almost to the end of the century. Her husband, you'll see, had died in 1866, when clearly there was space, but they'd not kept any space for his wife. When the non-denominational cemeteries opened, this was 1881 at Ouston Ferry, just below Epworth. Ouston Ferry, where Wesley nearly drowned in the 1840s as he crossed over from Doncaster to Grimsby. And we have this an account of how the Wesleyan choir, to mark this special celebration, the new cemetery was opened. Methodist ministers could officiate at the burials of their own congregations, and the remains of the deceased were conveyed to the cemetery, accompanied by the Wesleyan choir, who sung up to the grave, where the funeral service was conducted by the ministers. And this was a red letter day for Ouston Ferry Methodists, and I'm sure in many parts of the country it was a red letter special day. I've talked about these intramural interments. We have one at Anglesey Brook, John Dean. Now, I've not been able to find out specifically why he was buried at Anglesey Brook in 1841. I know that it said there was an argument with the local vicar, but I'm not sure whether the argument related to an issue of burial or whether it was just a personal falling out. If he had been a member of the parish, a resident, he had a right to be buried in the parish churchyard. Another Primitive Methodist, George Booth, travelling preacher, died Winster 1854, and the chapel, which is now no longer in use, states, in memory of George Booth, whose mortal remains are deposited near this tablet. I understand from the minister, the superintendent minister, that there were a few tentative excursions to try and find out where the grave was, but they couldn't find it. And John Garner, one of the described as senior Primitive Methodist minister, died at Epworth 1856. His mortal remains were interred on the Methodist Trust premises in Epworth. So says the Primitive Methodist magazine. There was no garden, there was no graveyard, so I can only assume that he was buried somewhere in the chapel. The chapel now is a Tesco one-stop store, and I reckon he's underneath the milk fridge, but I'm not quite sure. They don't really want to discuss it. So intramural interments. Even worse, Alexander Killam died 1798 and was interred at the chapel at Hockley, Nottingham, when the Methodist New Connection felt that it was their property legally, to discover 2 years later that it wasn't, and that it was still a Wesleyan chapel. And so after litigation, they had to give the chapel up and erect a new chapel. You'll see they removed the memorial monument to the new chapel, but Alexander Killam's body laid undisturbed as originally deposited in Hockley Wesleyan Chapel. And that's in the biography of Alexander Killam. Because the life of Methodist chapels is obviously not so long-lived as the life of parish churches. And classically, Thomas Fawcett, who established Wesleyan Methodism in Sleaford, has been buried 3 times. He was interred first 1831 in Westgate Chapel, Sleaford. Then when that closed and was rebuilt, he was exhumed and removed to the new Wesleyan Chapel at Newgate, Sleaford. And when that closed in 1969, he was reinterred in the cemetery in Sleaford. I think that's called life after death. Okay. Now, the option was to purchase a burial ground. Now, although there doesn't seem to have been early controversies, it clearly was an issue. Now, Gridland near Halifax claims it has the first Methodist burial ground, 1778, just about the same time as Wesley's Chapel in London. And Griffydam in Leicestershire took the opportunity not only to buy an initial plot in 1779, but in 1800 to buy an extended plot because they were having so many interments. And we have that list of local Primitive Methodist burial grounds: Brown Knoll, Chorley, Anglesey Brook, Huxley, and I could go on, Staffordshire, Biddlesmore Hilltop have theirs, and Woodmill at Yoxall. This was actually on eBay quite recently. The Wesleyan Methodist burial ground at Yeadon near Leeds. This is your ticket to say you've got the plot. Okay. And a photograph of the Wesleyan burial ground and a particular late 19th century mourning scene. I thought it was really interesting that should come up on eBay when I was looking at it. Some writers say that the 19th century demonstrates the shift from the old culture to a new culture that has been in part fashioned and refashioned by the evangelical revival. So the old culture, here lies the body of John Brown, son of Thomas Brown, factually so. To the new culture, an affectionate remembrance of, and you get the cross, sleeping in Jesus, the mourning, and a definite switch to something different. And this is from a book, which is an Anglesey Brook library, From Cockfighting to Chapel Building, Changes in Popular Culture in 18th and 19th Century Lincolnshire. And it seeks to demonstrate that the process of mourning was reflecting the new particular nonconformist culture. Burials were effected in local churchyards. Richard Smales was a Wesleyan Methodist minister who died in the Epworth Circuit, unfortunately, just 11 days before he was due to move to Sunderland. And he has a memorial in Epworth Churchyard, still in excellent condition, which we'll refer to later on. Now, these are the graveyard controversies. They are horrendous. I'm not going to go, I haven't got the time to go through each one in detail, but if I can just briefly refer to them. So the first one that comes to this highlighted is 1808 Wardley-cum-Belton, which is in Rutland. And the minister there refused to bury a baby who had been baptized by a Wesleyan minister. He refused to do it. He quoted himself as saying, "I will bury neither dissenter nor gypsy in my churchyard." How about that for a compliment? And the upshot was that he was taken to court by the Wesleyan connection, and eventually he was suspended for 3 months. And that case and the one below at Gedney, those two cases provided the case law that that Anglicans should accept the baptism of nonconformist ministers. And in the detailed case description, much was made of the opportunity in Anglican law to do emergency baptisms by a layperson. And the argument went, if an emergency baptism by a layperson is acceptable, why isn't a baptism by a Methodist minister, who the Anglican Church wouldn't accept as a minister, also acceptable? And again at Gedney, the minister was suspended for 3 months. Then we come on to the Primitive experience. So 1847 at Wormgate, where there was a refusal to bury a baby again who had been baptized by a Primitive Methodist minister. And the vicar was extremely difficult. He locked the churchyard. He refused to allow them in it. The family broke through the hedge and they left the body on the steps of the church. And the body was eventually buried. It caused national controversy. Horsey next the sea was again a Primitive Methodist congregation, and no minister was involved. The baby had not been baptized, so that wasn't the issue, but there was a right to bury the baby without the involvement of the Anglican priest in an odd corner of the churchyard. The problem arose that the Primitive Methodist steward supported the family and went with them, and they themselves buried the body of the baby in the churchyard. But they sung a hymn. They sung a Primitive Methodist hymn. And the vicar was so incensed that he summoned the Primitive Methodist steward for indecent behavior. And what's more, he was convicted of indecent behavior because he had outraged the Anglican congregation by singing a Primitive Methodist hymn over the open grave. He appealed, supported by the Primitive Methodist connection, and the sentence was quashed. Okay, it's almost unbelievable that it could happen, isn't it? It is in the details are recorded in the Primitive Methodist magazine. As in all cases, these are difficult to find. They don't readily come up. Now, another Norfolk one was Burnham Westgate in 1861. And there was a lot of anti-Primitive Methodist propaganda on this. The congregation, it was said, was determined to do the vicar down. And that the congregation had originally agreed to allow the vicar to read the order of service, the burial service, over a 24-year-old son who died. But when the vicar went into the church, the congregation turned right and went to the burial, to the grave. And the upshot was that the coffin was left in the open by the grave for 3 days before burial was effected. The local Norfolk papers said that the congregation had been stirred up by a Primitive Methodist preacheress who had no good reputation. I can't find out who she is. I'd love to know who she was, but I can't find out. I've done quite a lot of digging around to try and find out who she was. And then we come on to Dore at Sheffield in 1876, which I'll give you some of the details of. It was Dore that prompted Osborne Morgan, the MP, to really push to get this burial reform in place. 1878, just before the new Burial Reform Act came in, there was an issue at Aikenham where an unbaptized Baptist baby was due to be buried, and the family were locked out of the churchyard. And there was an argument between the vicar and the Baptist pastor. And then I'm going to give you a bit of detail about a later one when it all should have been sorted out. Again, when a family was locked out at Llanthrothon in Gwynedd. Yeah. So this is Horsey next to sea. An unbaptized baby was to be buried. The Primitive Methodist leader, the steward, accompanied the parents and they sung a hymn over the body. The priest ordered them to stop singing and summoned Joseph Fish with outrage in the churchyard, indecent behavior in the churchyard, by singing the hymn over an unbaptized child. And he was found guilty with a fine of 1 shilling, but the case was dropped on appeal and the conviction was quashed. The newspapers of the time suggest that the bishop persuaded the priest that it would be in the best interests to drop the case. I think he was probably right. the door graveyard controversy. Now, the Primitive Methodist, well, the vicar refused to read the service for the baby, and he was right in this. He didn't have to read the service if it was an unbaptized baby. But the issue was the baby had been baptized by a Primitive Methodist minister. The vicar refused to accept that as valid baptism, and he went against the previous case law. The papers emphasize, and the Primitive Methodist magazine emphasizes, that the parents of the child were not members of the Primitive Methodist Church, and sometimes had gone to the parish church, and sometimes had gone to hear the Primitive Methodist Church, but they had gone to the PM minister to arrange the burial. And the arrangement was this, and this takes some believing. After discussion with the vicar, the Primitive Methodist superintendent agreed that he would read the Primitive Methodist funeral service standing on a chair on the adjacent Turnpike Road in a line opposite with the grave. I find that astonishing. However, when they got to the churchyard, having given notice, the grave was not ready. So they went back to the Methodist chapel, the PM chapel, had their funeral service there, and they went back to the churchyard. There was another priest who insisted that he was going to read the burial service in the church before the interment. And the newspaper reports give this account of the coffin of a little baby being carried by 4 Primitive Methodist Sunday School scholars to the churchyard, grieving parents, and the priest insisting that he was going to read the Anglican burial service, despite what had been arranged by the actual rector himself. And the case was taken up by Osborne Morgan and became the final straw, I think, to effect burial reform. Now, the year after, 1877, PM magazine refers to Doveholes, and I think this is real in Derbyshire. I think this is really significant. A chapel and a school with burial ground adjoining have recently been opened at Doveholes. 'Tis not often burial grounds are attached to our places of worship, but the Friends of Doveholes, having the opportunity, decided to settle the vexed question of burials without the interference of Parliament. And that's really significant. It shows how widespread and how common the understanding of these problems was. So that's the PM magazine, 1877. It should all have been sorted out, but this is the Llanfrothen burial case, 1888. It's Wesleyan. It's David Lloyd George. It's the case that propelled Lloyd George to national publicity and prominence. And it's, again, the heart is nonconformist burial rites. What had happened was that the Llanfrothen parish church had extra land conveyance to it in 1879. No conditions. On came the Burial Reform Act, and the rector decided he was going to amend this. So he went to the person who gave the land and got her to write a new conveyance retrospectively, which said the new land was only to be for Anglican interments. Lloyd George advised the family and told them to go ahead, to break into the churchyard, to bury the body by lantern light, and that he would take the consequences. Good old Lloyd George. So it came that the rector claimed the defendants had wrongly entered the plaintiff's land, i.e. the churchyard. They had dug a grave, they had buried a corpse, and they had conducted a funeral service. And his argument was that the land had been conveyed solely for Anglican interments. But of course, it was retrospectively conveyed on that basis. And he claimed £50. It was defended by Lloyd George. Lloyd George lost, but went to appeal and won on appeal. And that was sort of a real red marker that you couldn't play about with this Burial Reform Act. Now, This again was a parish in Lincolnshire that I was closely involved with, Ouston Ferry. We've already mentioned Ouston Ferry, and Donald Ryan wrote this up this case up in the proceedings of the WHS. So what happened was that the Wesleyan minister, the Reverend H. Keat, his younger daughter died, Annie Augusta Keat, and she was buried in the churchyard. She was a resident of the parish, and there was an Anglican burial service read. But the Keat family wanted this inscription, and it may look fairly standard, but the vicar objected to the Reverend H. Keat being described as a Wesleyan minister. He was the Wesleyan minister, but that he said in the eyes of a priest of the Church of England, no Wesleyan could properly be termed a minister. And so arose this controversy. Henry Keat wrote to Christopher Wordsworth, the then Bishop of Lincoln, and explained the situation and said he simply wanted this inscription to be erected. It was a problem because the vicar wouldn't communicate face to face with the Wesleyan minister. They communicated with one another through the stonemason, which I think was not the easiest way. Christopher Wordsworth considered the issue and said, good heavens, if we allow Wesleyan ministers to be called, Wesleyans to be called ministers, there might be a day when we'll allow women to be called ministers, or gypsies. And this is all documented. Henry Keat took the case to the Wesleyan Conference and presented it as the Anglican Church being dogmatic, unwilling to consider the particularities of cases, and he wished the Wesleyan Conference to assert and affirm that Wesleyans were ministers, and they did. And so this is the case that established that Methodist nonconformist ministers could rightly be considered as ministers. Okay. I've got here just two examples of how it moved. So Parkinson Milson, a Primitive Methodist traveling minister, buried a very splendid funeral by all accounts. The cortege proceeded to Springbank Cemetery where the interment took place. And after the coffin had been deposited in the resting place, the Reverend T. Whitaker, this is a Methodist, read the burial service. But then Robert Key, Primitive Methodist, 1876, his funeral, and I'd like to highlight this, he rests in a spot that has been purchased for the burial of such of our superannuated ministers as may die in this city. And I understand that is a spot that is unconsecrated. One of the things that came out of all this was that burials were not encouraged in chapels. In the two instances I've given of mausoleums and crypts, when the government inspectors came, they were horrified, in Halifax especially, that there was only a plain boarded wall separating the place of interment from the place of Sunday school or the place of the caretaker's dwelling. And so there was some good came out of it. But this is a horror story of what nonconformists endured during the course of the 19th century. It is the graveyard slot. Thank you.